We're here with Joe, and we're going to teach you how to make an amazing pit-style Texas brisket. We're going to cover brisket butchery so it cooks perfectly. We're also going to show you how to wrap it properly, and we're going to get into a little bit of barbecue shooting too. You really can get an epic brisket on any little cooker. That is the best bite of brisket barbecue I've ever had, for sure.
Biggest thing about cooking barbecue is just following certain steps, right? When you start to understand how a piece of meat cooks, what temperature cooking, whether there's convection involved or anything like that, like that's what's most important, not necessarily time and temperature. It's those two things with the addition of knowing what is this piece of meat and how do I get it to the end of the line.
So the biggest reason to focus on the trim is, as you guys can see, this brisket is a very, very uneven cut of meat. And also includes two different muscles. We have this big chunk right here. This is kind of like the decal or the point, which is like the more marbled section. And then it tapers off into this really thin section, which is called the flat, which is a much, much leaner cut. And in order for us to cook this properly and make sure it cooks evenly throughout a long 12 to 14 hour cook, we wanna kind of get this as uniform as possible. Even though this is kind of like a restaurant quality type of trim, and a lot of people will say like we're cutting off way too much, but even as a home cook, in order for you to be able to serve the entire thing and get the best slices you possibly can for your family and friends, the restaurant trim is kind of like the best trim for the backyard at home as well. As you guys can see here, there's a lot of fat that's covering on the bottom of the brisket. This is not typical for briskets that you would find in grocery stores. And for that reason, we're definitely gonna have to take this down as well. And when we do so, we're gonna be able to see like the grain of the muscle of the brisket. And that's gonna help us a lot to figure out how we wanna cook this and how we wanna trim it down later. Before we talk about trimming this brisket, I want to just talk about the knife that we're going to be using. A lot of people use different types of knives. Some people even use like carving knives because it has a longer blade. I like using this 6-inch curved bony knife. This is a Victorinox knife. I've been using a knife like this for years, and it's just something that I feel really, really comfortable with. It's nice and nimble, so on these weird sections of the brisket where you're trying to get really clean cuts, it helps a lot. Also, I like the curved blade because I can get really nice clean cuts and nice clean strokes while I'm trimming this brisket up. And they're cheap, very cheap. So for the first section, the first part of this brisket is we're gonna take out that ginormous heel fat that we're talking about. With this section, you can kind of get your finger underneath it and kind of peel it back a little bit. So if you can, try to use your hands to do so. And there's almost a seam that is happening in between there. And so once you can pull it back and find that seam, you're just gonna use the tip of your knife and just kind of scrape it down. And you can kind of, as you're pulling it, you can kind of hear it tearing just a little bit. And the further and further you can get your fingers down there, just peel it back, use that tip of the knife. And there we go. And then once you can kind of get underneath there, you can kind of see where this heel fat meets the brisket. Turn your knife, and again, continue to just use the tip of your knife to peel it all back. So this thick piece of fat right here is, like we mentioned before, it's really thick, so it's not gonna render, and it's also actually gonna affect the way our brisket cooks in this section, just because it's so insulated with that fat. So it's very, very important to take this piece out. All right, as we mentioned before, the fat that's covering this entire bottom piece is very unusual. And as you guys can see, it is quite thick, and we definitely don't want all that fat in the bottom of our brisket. But in order to do it so that we're not fraying our brisket, and we want it to become really nice and smooth, because any rough edges or any sharp parts on your brisket are most likely dry and burn up, and we don't want that at all. So the best way to do it is on the very edge of this brisket, we can kind of see the way that the grain of the muscle is going. And as I can see these small little lines, I can see that the muscle fibers are going at an angle this way. And so as I trim this top portion off, I want to go in that same direction because it's going to help us get really nice clean cuts. So anything that you can lift up, definitely take off with your hands, kind of like we did with the heel fat. Oh. All right. So again, kind of like we did with the heel fat, we want to be able to go underneath it. Don't cut too deep though. Again, the way that I'm cutting, I'm going with the grain of the muscle. But as you guys can see, this fat is kind of pillowy, which kind of helps us to pull it back a little bit. And whenever you can, just use your hands to peel it back so that you can reduce the chances of cutting into the meat. So typically for a brisket, I like to find a brisket that's in between the weight of, I would say like a 13 to 16 pound brisket. Generally within that weight range, it allows that, usually the brisket is a little bit more even and more uniform in size. And it also generally tells me that it's gonna cook a little bit better and a little bit faster. If you get briskets that are too large or they're 20 pounds, 25 pounds, one is gonna take forever to cook. And also there's a lot more fat in those kind of briskets, and you're just not gonna have as much brisket to serve. All right, so as we can see, we're getting close to the bottom of this brisket. Now that we're getting close enough to where we can actually see the grain of the muscle, there are these still pockets of fat that we want to get off, because if we leave these chunks of fat on here and let's say at some point during the cook our fire gets a little bit too hot, these parts can get really crispy and kind of get charred up. So later on when you go to serve your brisket and you're trying to slice it, these parts are going to be really hard and start to almost shred your slices a little bit. So we wanted to make sure again that we get this as clean as possible, because everything that we're trying to do is thinking about the end product and making sure that every slice that we get is super smooth. So when you get to these parts where it's a little bit harder, I like to have my hand underneath and lift it up. And instead of using a really short sawing motion, I like to start my knife at the base and use the entire length of the blade to get these long kind of like pieces off so it's nice and smooth. So again, this portion right here, using the base of the knife and use the entire length of the blade. You can also pick this piece up and just kind of push with your knife. Lift up and just push with your knife. Right here, I think we're pretty good. We got all that really thick fat off. We can see kind of the marbling of our brisket. We can see the grain of our brisket. Some of these parts are a little thinner. We can probably take a little more off. And I think we are good to go on the bottom. So again, with the bottom of our brisket, the two things that we want to do is take off that big chunk of that heel fat, just because it's not gonna render and it's gonna mess up the slices on this side, and then get as much fat off and then as much silver skin on the bottom as possible and make it super clean. Right here on the lean portion, we got most of this fat and this like the chunky silver skin, the fat off. And here, as we move on top of the brisket, this is where that decal and that marbled portion is. So having a little bit more fat here is just gonna happen, and that's what we kind of want on this side. We're gonna take off a little more fat here so we can have a flatter surface. And there you go. I just took off that part so that later on when we flip the brisket, it'll lay down a lot flatter instead of having this little piece that's gonna lift this brisket up. But now that we got the bottom of our brisket trimmed and cleaned up, this is where a bulk of the work is gonna happen, and the bulk of the work in terms of shaping it and taking off any uneven pieces of our brisket. And the first thing that we're gonna start off is with taking down our hump or our mohawk that we talked about before. So for me, I like to do it where I like having the hump or the mohawk facing towards me or the decal towards my direction, because I want to be able to create a big cut that's gonna be nice and clean and push like I did when I was cleaning down the bottom. So this brisket is a lot different than briskets I've trimmed before. It's a lot bigger and a lot wider. And you can see this giant kind of flap of meat that's on the side right here. And this, again, is why it's super important that we trim the brisket properly. This portion right here is super, super lean. Doesn't have that much fat on top of it, and if we leave this on and we cook it for 12 to 14 hours, there's almost no chance this brisket is gonna be worth eating. So we're gonna definitely taper this down. All right. So I'm gonna pull, I like to pull and stretch my brisket on all sides just because I wanna get an idea of how big and how wide my brisket actually is. And from there, I want to trace a line with my knife going down this way so it gives me an idea of how big, how wide my brisket is going to be at the end. And again, I'm just trying to get rid of all this meat that I know is not going to be worth eating at the end of the day. So from here, now that I got traced that line, make sure you measure twice just in case. And then from here, taking this all the way down. And once we do that, it's gonna kind of give us an idea of how thick that lean is underneath. And then it's gonna also show us how much marbling we have underneath here as well. So it's not, like, one of the reasons, again, is we're taking off all this meat that we can't serve, but it's also gonna give us an idea of like how much marbling and how much fat we need to trim off on the rest of this brisket. Now the next part that we see here, this is like the hump and the mohawk section. Once we took all that off, you can see that this is another big chunk of fat that's really gonna affect our cook, and it's really not gonna be worth serving at all. Because if you did give someone a slice, you can see how much meat there is and how much fat there's on top. So for that reason, we are also gonna shave this down. And earlier we were talking about trying to create this brisket so it's kind of a more even height from end to end. And this portion is definitely way taller, and like we mentioned before, it's a lot of fat. So I want to take my knife and put it at an angle about here and have it cut all the way down to where the flat and the point meet. So up to this section, I want to take that slight angle and almost create a new kind of rounded shape for my brisket. Take that angle. Again, you're using the full length of your blade and you're pushing. And if you guys have seen a bunch of briskets from like Texas barbecue restaurants, you've kind of seen this cut, you've kind of seen this shape, and now you can see that it's a lot more uniform going across. And that's what we're looking for. It's gonna help us for our brisket to cook faster, it's gonna help the brisket cook a lot more evenly, and it's gonna make sure that we can make sure that every single slice that we have is servable to a customer. So at this point, we took the mohawk down, and now we're really trying to figure out what is the shape of my brisket gonna be. Because right now you can see how long it is, and it's a little strange, but also this portion of our brisket, this lean, kind of tapers off, and it's super, super thin. And we definitely don't want that. But if we look on the opposite side of this lean, it's a lot thicker. And so we want to cut off and round off a portion to make sure that the entire lean section has an even thickness, and it's gonna help us cook this brisket a lot more evenly. So as I look at this brisket, I wanna figure out like where is it thick enough for me to start trimming it off. And I'm looking for probably somewhere between a half an inch to an inch thickness on that lean, and that's telling me it's roughly about here. So this is kind of where I know that my brisket will last to cook, but anything past that will most likely be way too thin and it's gonna dry up. So from here, where I found that I said to myself, this is thick enough, I'm gonna take my knife and I'm gonna go at a slight angle, and we're gonna cut all this off right here. So this seems like it's a lot of waste, but this really won't last in the brisket cook. And all this, we can talk about the trim later. You can use it for sausage making in restaurants. We make it for burgers. If you guys don't have a meat grinder at home, you can, you know, put it in chilies and things like that. So it's all still good meat. It just won't be good for brisket cooking in this way. So at this point, it's starting to take shape, and we had that really wide, really ugly brisket. We had that lean that was stretched out really wide. We had that lean that was really thin, and now everything generally has the right thickness that we're looking for all around. But the other thing that we have to clean up is there's a lot of sharp edges on this brisket. So as I pull off that portion up top where we took off that hump, we have this portion right here that is definitely way too thin and it's just fat, so we want to trim that off. Any sharp corners that we have on these briskets that we made these really, really sharp cuts where there are these corners, those corners are going to dry up and burn as well. So anything that's kind of sticking up or stretching out, we want to round off and kind of give like a shape, like it's almost like a shoe where it has a really rounded heel, and this is kind of like the toe box of your shoe, and we want to make sure it's nice and smooth on all edges of it. So we're going to start off with this top portion, and we just want to take this off, and we're just creating a new surface for our brisket. Okay, take that off, and then again, just kind of pull up with your hand. If there's anything that sticks off again, we're just rounding it off. Talking about these corners where lean, I'm gonna push it out as much as I possibly can. And some people are really good about having really nice knife skills where they can just go and round it and have it be really smooth. But for those of you guys who are maybe new to trimming briskets or just maybe aren't as comfortable taking those kind of moves, I would recommend taking off corners. This is how I used to train guys. I used to train like in barbecue restaurants, where if you have the sharp corner, you're just going to take off that corner, which creates these two smaller corners, and you're going to take off that, you're going to take off that, and with those three cuts, now you kind of have a new rounded shape. So if you don't feel comfortable with that, don't worry about it, just take it off, just take off those corners. And just to show you guys again, take off this corner, and then take off these two smaller corners. And now, like, you can see your brisket has this really nice rounded shape where it's not gonna catch air. There's no edges that are gonna get discolored or dried out or burned just because we left those corners on there. All right, let's move over to the side of the decal or the point. Generally, this side is naturally more rounded, but there are still these little sharp corners here. There's a little bit more fat that we can probably trim off down here. And so again, we just want to create a really nice rounded shape. So this corner, come here and round it off. And when I am trimming when I'm trimming kind of like this decal at this point, I like to think about it like you're trying to take off a peel off of an orange, or you're like supreming citrus or something like that. You're kind of starting at the top and you're working your knife around and then rounding it so you can create this shape that's not going to catch air. It's really nice and smooth. It's going to give your brisket a nice presentation. So again, we're going to start here, rounding it off, and nice clean cut that way. Again, just keep pulling and yanking on anything, and you guys will see that there's still stragglers. Like, you don't have to obsess as much as I do. I'll probably take all day trimming a brisket if I really wanted to, but you know, you just want to make it look pretty. So the very last thing that we're going to try to do, now that we took all the excess, we're happy with the shape, probably the biggest issue that most people have with trimming brisket is taking off that layer of fat that exists on top. Just because it's a little bit uneven, some portions of your brisket are really thick, other parts of it are really, really thin, and this is where we want to be very careful not to scalp it too much, but sometimes it happens. This is going to take practice for you guys to do so. But I'm going to show you guys a trick to help you guys determine where you need to cut more fat off of and other portions that you can just leave as is. So on this portion of our lean, it's quite thick, and I can feel it. Like this portion is nice and pillowy, it's thin, but as I move to this section, it's a lot thicker. Like I can leave my fingerprint in there, and that's definitely telling me I need to take some more fat off. But when you're trying to decide how much you need to take off and you're scared that you're gonna end up taking all the fat off, I learned this trick from one of my old bosses, Leonard at Truth Barbecue. He takes his two fingers, like his index finger and his thumb, and he kind of rakes his hands across this brisket. And as you do that, you kind of create this groove. And that right there, everything that's sitting on top, that's all fat that we can trim off of it. If I were to do that on the center portion, there's a small groove, but not so much that I'm worried that it's gonna be too much. So from here, I'm gonna create this groove. So from here, I'm gonna start with the base of my knife, and I know that all this right here is good to come off. And I'm gonna, again, use the entire length of my knife as much as possible, and I'm gonna grab this kind of tail to take off this entire layer of fat. And this is gonna definitely take a lot of practice, because if you let it warm up way too much, this fat is gonna be really, really hard to cut through. So again, we're gonna use our fingers to rake our fingers across, find the tail, and take off that fat. And then you're just gonna just keep doing that until you can't really catch any more fat or it doesn't create those grooves anymore. And that's gonna give us an idea of having a really nice and even, not too thick fat cap that's going to render really well, and it's gonna kind of give us that like nice sweet fat on top of our brisket. Sometimes you'll get brisket where it's a little bit too thick and it doesn't render properly, and it's that fat that looks really white when you slice into it, and it doesn't give you that smoky sweet flavor. It just kind of tastes greasy, and when you have too much fat on your brisket is also going to kind of taste a little bit under seasoned, just because when you have more fat, you kind of need to add more salt. But if you leave too much, you run the risk of over salting your food. So it's just much easier to make sure that you trim it properly, get that even layer of fat all the way across, and that's going to help you create that really sweet fat that you're looking for on a smoked brisket. All right, so I think we're done. I'm just going to do one final check, kind of, and stretch out all the sides of the brisket just to see if there's anything that's still lingering, any pieces that need to come off. This corner is poking out just a little bit, so I'm going to round that just a little bit more. And that's pretty good. So now we got a lean section as thin as it was earlier. Like, it's a nice thickness, and it's gonna cook really well. Nothing's gonna dry out as long as we keep control of our temperature. Our fat has a really nice thickness right here, so it's gonna render really nicely and give us that sweet fat, especially with a lot of that smoke and the salt and the black pepper that we're gonna add later. Thank you. And now, like we said before, the whole point is to make sure we took that really big, ugly piece of brisket and create it into a uniform shape to where it's gonna be cooked nice and even. So if we look at our height of our brisket as it is now compared to before, like, it's pretty uniform from end to end, and that's what we're looking for. All right, so after we trimmed up our briskets, there is a lot of trim, but none of it's gonna go to waste. We have all this meat right here that can be used mostly for sausage, for barbecue restaurants. You can do them for burgers. Some of this thinner fat that we talked about earlier, this is great for running down to make tallow to cook with, or for anything else that you may need. And then this big chunkier fat, that's great for grinding and putting into other leaner cuts if you want to make your own, like burger blends, or especially for sausage. This is the stuff that I always reserve for making sausage, because it has a great texture when you grind it up in the same way that you do with your raw beef. What we're going to be doing is basically doing a seasoning of 50-50 by volume of kosher salt and 16 mesh black pepper. And so the 16 mesh refers to kind of the coarseness of the black pepper, and that's what's gonna give you that bark on the outside. If the pepper is too fine, it'll kind of give like a flaky texture to the brisket that's not really great and won't give you that barky texture you're looking for. And if it's too coarse, it'll most likely fall off because it's too heavy. If you bite into it, it might be a little bit crunchy and might be a little bit too spicy as well. This is just a normal shaker that you give. And the reason why you want this size is as you season your brisket, you want all this extra space to continuously mix your salt and pepper around. Your salt and pepper will start to separate if you don't kind of mix it as you kind of go. The other thing that you want to keep in mind is the cap size on top of your lid. We cut a hole into them so that our salt and pepper doesn't get clogged. When we're seasoning this brisket, we're going to start with the bottom side first. The reason being, the last thing that we want to season and touch up is the presentation side, which is going to be this side that has all of our fat and our fat cap. And we want to kind of keep a consistent, like, smooth motion while we season. So we're going to season from high up, and we want to get a nice even coat all the way across. And as it comes out, I'm looking for how much pepper and salt is coming out, and every now and then when I see that it's not being mixed evenly, shake up the seasoning again and continue from then on. And as you kind of do so, you can kind of pat the seasoning into the brisket. A lot of times if I feel like the brisket is a little bit too dry, I'll just spray with a little bit of water just so it's a little bit wet, but you don't have to go crazy in creating a huge slather just for something like this. I'm gonna flip it over to the top, give it a good shake, and just nice and easy. Now the next thing that we want to do is make sure we season all the sides. If you guys have cooked brisket before and the top and the bottom look really great, but the edges of your brisket are like bright red from all that smoke, usually comes from the fact that you probably didn't season the sides all the way through. And again, that black pepper is going to really help create that crust on the outside. So a lot of times, if you're doing a lot of briskets, you can take some of the seasoning and just rub it on the sides. But because we have the shaker, we're going to lift it up, and we're just going to kind of have a light seasoning. You're going to use like the palm and the back of your hand almost as like a backboard for you to sprinkle into your hand, and you're going to pat it into the sides. So from here, and then from this side, I'm going to use the back of my hand. This brisket looks great. It's got all the sides covered. The salt, pepper is even all the way across. We got ourselves a perfectly seasoned brisket.
Today, what we're gonna do is gonna map out an entire cook that you would have that's on average about 12 hours to kind of give you an idea of what's happening with your brisket throughout the entire cook. So in terms of an entire brisket cook, I like to break it up into like 4 stages, because when you're cooking with fire, when you're cooking with charcoal, when you're dealing with a cut of meat that's quite uneven, we always want to work within ranges and variables and things like that. But at the same time, there is technique to cooking this big piece of meat. So during the entire time, we're going to be talking about 2 different temperatures. One is going to be the cooking temperature, and the second one is going to be kind of our average internal temperature of what the brisket should be. So in the beginning, first like 4 hours or so, we're going to be maintaining probably a cooking temperature between 240 to 260 for pretty much most of the cook. It's going to start to tenderize our brisket. We're also going to be able to dry out the surface of our brisket to get great color and great texture as it starts to shrink up and expel a little bit of moisture. And as we get to a point where our brisket is getting to be tender, but now we really want to render some fat, really set the bark, that's when we're going to bring the temperature up to about 280 degrees. And at that point, it's just a little bump of heat to kind of render out any excess fat to make sure we get that really nice golden fat that has that really nice sweet flavor. And any bits of our brisket that might still be a little bit too tight are going to be nice and loose during the last portion of our cooking process.
So just like an offset smoker, what we want to do is create as much airflow as possible. We have unlit coals to start, and then we're gonna add in a few lit coals to allow it to slowly cook over time. So I'm just gonna grab a few coals that are hot, and we're just gonna wedge them to the side right here. We have the vents on the bottom wide open, put the grate on top, and most importantly, when we're setting this up, the holes on the lid are gonna be in the opposite side of where the fire is. And then we're gonna adjust by playing around with the vents on the top and the vents in the bottom to make sure that we create the right level of airflow. And if it gets a little bit too hot, we can close down the vents a little bit. And if it's too cool, either we can add more coals to the fire or we can just open up the vents. Now that we got our smoker like warmed up, so as we position this brisket, there's a couple things that we want to think about. We want to think about making sure that our brisket is not too close to the fire. And we also want to make sure that the brisket isn't touching the rim of the smoker, because those spots can get really hot. The brisket is quite large, but during the cook, it's gonna shrink. So if you feel like it's a little bit too close, it's okay. And also, you can kind of squeeze it just a tad, just so it's not touching the sides. You're gonna close a lid and just monitor temperatures. And again, the fire's on this side, and the lid with the vents are on top of the meat. That way, as it cooks, we can get all that heat and that smoke traveling over on top. In terms of cooking temperatures for this cook, just to start, we're looking at about being around 240 to 260 degrees. We want it to be at like a safe temperature where we're not worrying about our brisket getting charred up or burned, but we still want to cook it a little bit hotter just so that we can get a little bit of color and that we can get enough smoke on our brisket during the first 3 to 4 hours of our cook. What we're really doing with this brisket is trying to expel as much moisture as possible. But in the very beginning of the stage, the one thing that we don't want to do is cook it so hot that we're kind of squeezing all the water and all like the fat out of our brisket. We want to slowly, gradually do that, and that's why we're starting at a lower temperature in the first stages of the cook. And so all we're trying to do is really bring the internal temperature of our brisket up. All right, so the setup that we have right now is we got 2 briskets that are staged at different times. And luckily for us, Grant got up early to put briskets on at those times so that we can see like the different stages of how your brisket looks, development of bark and the color of the brisket that's changing, and kind of compare what is happening between these critical times throughout the cook. First one that we're gonna check is your first kind of mark about 3 hours in of maintaining a temperature about 240 to 260 degrees. You can see that this fat is starting to get nice and golden. There's some spots that are a bit more yellowy. When we're trimming briskets, we want to make sure everything is really nice and smooth and we have full fat coverage on top. There are certain spots like right here and right here where you might see a little bit of like exposed brisket, and those spaces will tend to create what we call right here this pooling, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. It will eventually happen during a cook even if you trim it perfectly. So if that pooling does happen really early on and you just let it sit, it's gonna continue to like accumulate more and more liquid on the surface. When that happens and later on when you go to move the brisket, you finally dump it off, you're gonna have a really big bald patch right in the middle of your brisket just because all that smoke is not gonna be able to get through all the fat and the water that's getting expelled out of that brisket. So anytime you see something like that, tip over the brisket, you can run off any of the excess liquid off. It's still very firm. A lot of that moisture is still left in that brisket, which I'm expecting at this point. Eventually it will soften up with an extended period of time being this low temperature. The brisket does this weird thing where it's gonna feel loose, get really, really tight, and loosen up again. If you're kind of poking around your brisket and a lot of the edges feel really, really firm, like a brick, you probably cooked a little bit too hot to begin with. So again, every smoker is slightly different. Yours might be just cooking a little bit hotter than the one that we're using. So at this point, maybe close down some of the dampers, maybe use a little less coals for the next couple hours. All we're really trying to do is bring the internal temperature of the brisket up very slowly. And if you guys keep opening and closing this lid to see if like your brisket is looking fine, it'll just take forever to cook your brisket. So in the beginning stages, just worry about the temperature, keep it at that 240, 260 degree temperature. Don't look at it all. If you go in and spritz it, your color will be really washed off. You won't be able to develop the bark. Your pepper might be falling off, and you're just gonna have to extend your cook a couple hours. As you guys can see right now, even just with an additional about 2.5 hours or so, the fat was a lot firmer, but there's a little bit more give to it. It's starting to crack a little bit too with like the coarseness of that black pepper, but also because it's expelling moisture and we didn't add more moisture by spraying liquid on top, it's really starting to create this textury bark that we're trying to look for. As we continue to cook it, as we continue to expel moisture, it'll only get better, it'll only get crustier as things go on. It's starting to feel like it's rendering a little bit more. While earlier it was really bouncy and really smooth, now they're starting to be a little more give and it feels a little more cloudy as it's slowly starting to kind of cook down. The color on the brisket is much darker. We're starting to get more of that brown color instead of being really bright red and kind of having that yellowish fat. And that's how we're starting to build those really nice rich colors, by expelling more moisture. We're still kind of seeing that pooling that again is going to happen on your brisket just as it continues to push out more liquid. But just as we did before, if you see any liquid, tip it over,
None of the bark is washed off, and that's giving you a good indication that we control the temperature throughout. And one thing that you probably notice here is that this edge right here is curling up, and it's gonna happen in all your briskets, because just like we talked about when we're trimming briskets, that lean end really tapers off into this thin corner. And that's the reason why we spend so much time taking off those thin bits and rounding off those corners. Internal temperature of this brisket right now is about 155 degrees, and we're kind of right on target. And what's gonna happen is it's gonna slowly come up to about 160 and 165, and that increasing of internal temperature is gonna just stop. And when that happens, a lot of people get nervous, because that's what we call the stall. And your brisket is gonna sit at that spot as it continues to push out a little more liquid. And we're really waiting until we get to about 175, maybe 180 or so, and you'll feel your brisket start to relax. And at that point is when we're kind of ready to move on to the next step. But until then, we just wanna maintain our temperatures and just watch your fires until that happens. So we have another brisket that's in here, and it's the same time as the brisket that we just checked. Obviously, one side of the brisket is much closer to the fire source, so definitely see a lot more bubbling, a lot more sizzling. And you know, at this early in the stage, it's not exactly what you want, just because you want to keep some moisture in there, because it's going to be cooking for a couple more hours. So something that we might do is flip it around. But if I poke on this fat, the color on this side is kind of what we're looking for, and it kind of matches the brisket that we had just checked, while the brisket on this back of the end, it looks like it's about an hour or so behind this one. So if you are using a PK, I would say try to rotate it every now and then to kind of get it a little bit more consistent, a little bit more even cook. And yeah, let's take a look. It's got a little bit more even color just because, you know, we don't have one side that's really close to the fire. There's a little bit of bubbling on the surface, which is telling me this fire might be a little bit hot. It's holding a little bit more heat. So if you are cooking in a ceramic and you happen to see a lot of sizzling up top, I would just kind of keep in mind to maybe back down on that heat just a little bit, at least for now, just so that we don't end up, you know, drying on our brisket in this long cook. It's rendering really nice. We have a nice even color all the way around. So yeah, this one is looking pretty good as well. So we got a little bit of pooling right now, which is, again, it's fine. We're gonna tip it again, and none of that bark underneath is super washed off, so I'm happy about that. All the corners are getting a little tight because we're right in the middle of the stall, but we're okay. This side that's closer to the fire is a little bit more loose opposed to this side. So at this point during the cook, just so that we can get it a little more even, I'm going to flip this brisket around. And give it a chance to even out just a little bit more. But other than that, I really love the color that we're developing on here. The fat is starting to feel a little squishy, definitely needs a little more time. I think probably in the next hour or so, the sides of the lean will become a little more loose, and you know, hopefully we'll be really close to wrap. All right, so we're gonna check this brisket on this green egg and just see where it's at. And the fat is feeling really soft, like we were looking for earlier. Man, this is looking really nice. So I think this brisket is ready to wrap. So whether you're trying to wrap your briskets for just resting or for the purposes of protecting it so you can cook at a higher temperature, you kind of have different options. And don't feel like you have to be stuck to one way. I would say whatever you feel comfortable with, or whatever things you have at home, whether it's butcher paper or foil, you can do it any way that you want. And one of my favorite things about barbecue is you can play around with different factors to come out with different results to find out your favorite type of barbecue. So this brisket is finished, and I just want to wrap this brisket up so that it has a little bit more moisture as we rest it until it's ready to serve. I'm gonna use 2 sheets of butcher paper that I'm gonna kind of shingle together. We're outside right now, and your paper can kind of blow around all over the place, so I'm gonna spread this brisket grease just a little bit so it can stick. And then spray down the surface so we can make sure that this paper is nice and pliable. And especially as we make these really weird folds around this round piece of meat, I want to make sure that this paper is nice and wet.
I always like to position the brisket so that I have a little bit more paper on the point side of the brisket. I want to have more paper that's going to be able to fold on top of that side. I'm going to have that heel fat that's facing towards me. This side is a little bit more rounded, and I want to make sure that we make it really nice and flush as we wrap this brisket. I like to move my brisket a little bit closer to the edge of the paper, and when I bring it over, I don't want it completely folding over on top. Later on, when you go to check your brisket, I like to have access to feel for the bottom of the brisket, to feel for that memory foam texture that we were talking about earlier. I always wrap the point side first where it's the most rounded, just because we want to make that nice and flush. I do this twist. So from here, I'm going to take my right hand that's closest to the point, and I'm going to twist it this way. And the purpose for that, so now that this curved section is really flush, now we can make a really nice fold where there's no more air pocket. So from here, we made that fold. And across. I still want excess to here, but I also want this really tight. I'm gonna just tuck this paper just a little bit underneath, but I have this space that I can go in and check the brisket if I need to towards the end. And here, now, I'm gonna fold this next section over, and I'm gonna press down and conform around this brisket. And so at this point, I can take my hands off of it, and you can kind of see the general shape, and it's kind of nestled around this brisket. And as I continue to make these folds, it's just gonna make this a lot tighter. I like to call this like the runway of the brisket. So the width of your brisket, you want that same exact width towards the end, that as we wrap it, it's gonna fold nicely, and any excess you can tuck underneath, and it's gonna look really pretty. So from here, I'm gonna just double check, make sure this side is nice and tight, make that nice runway, make sure this is nice and tight. I'm gonna fold, pull this nice and tight. And I'm gonna bring this over. Any excess, I'm gonna tuck underneath. The tighter this brisket is, the more evenly it'll cook. Pull that. Now you have a really nice tight brisket. It's ready to go back into the smoker, and because it's wrapped up, now we can bump up the heat a little bit more to kind of tenderize the brisket. Similar to the butcher paper, we're still going to use 2 sheets, but instead of having them kind of shingle side by side, we're actually going to make a crisscross pattern with these. So we're going to create a little X in the spot that, and it's going to be the spot we're going to land the brisket. In this situation, what we're trying to do is nestle this brisket with this foil around it. But the way that we're gonna do it is, instead of pulling inward, we're actually gonna wrap away from the brisket. The reason why we did it that way is because at the end of it, we have these handles kind of around the sides of this foil belt, which makes it really easy for you to move around this brisket. Like if it's done really quickly, you can just quickly grab this. I would definitely recommend going to like a restaurant store and trying to find a super wide, heavy duty foil, just because the last thing you want to have happen is you're trying to move briskets around like this and it's not sturdy, or the foil's not long enough and your brisket just falls through. Because you have this foil, it's still going to collect all the juices that are still going to be rendering, but you leave the top exposed, so you'll still be able to continue to render that fat that's on top. I think that most people, once they try this, they really love it. All right, so we're gonna put this foil boat brisket back on. Because it's protected, again, we can afford to ramp up the temperature. So the same temperature that we're using to render out that top fat, like 280 degrees, is that temperature that we're gonna maintain until this brisket is finished. It's a couple of things that we're gonna do to ramp up the heat towards the end. Like we can add another wood chunk in here when it's gonna burn a little bit hotter with these coals. And one thing that we can also do at this time is, especially with the foil boat brisket, since it's exposed on top, I'm gonna open up the top vents, and I'm also gonna open up the bottom vent down here. Because it's protected, we can afford to kind of get as much airflow as possible. It'll help increase the temperature, and with all that airflow happening, your temperatures will stay a lot steadier. Because the vents are closed and all you're doing is adding more coals just to get it hotter, you might choke out that fire and it might be really hard to maintain that higher temperature.
What I like to feel for is the very bottom of the lean. At the bottom of the lean has a really nice squishy texture, almost like a memory foam pillow. And if you're unsure of how your brisket should feel, stick an instant read thermometer at the center of the lean, and you're looking for anywhere between like 203 to maybe 210 in order to get all that collagen and connective tissue to kind of settle and have a nice, like really soft, like fatty texture. It needs to cool down and come to a resting point to where all that juice kind of settles throughout our entire brisket again.
Okay, this brisket is fully rested. It's sitting at 155 right now, and this thing is ready to cut. Before we get into cutting, just gonna talk about the knife that I'm gonna be using today. This is just a 12-inch slicing knife or carving knife. It's also a bread knife. This one has the serrations on it. I personally like using a knife with serrations because I think it helps kind of cut through the bark a little bit better. And then afterwards, the blade is long enough where we can get really nice clean slices out of your brisket. Usually when you're opening up a brisket out of butcher paper, there's really not much to it, but sometimes the paper does stick to each other. So when you're doing so and you feel like it is, just be very careful, because if you're a little bit too aggressive, you might end up kind of shredding your brisket. So if you do feel a little slight tug on that paper, just be a little more cautious. In terms of shape, it doesn't look that much different, but the feel of it is a lot different than when we pulled it off. It doesn't have that like memory foam pillow feel that we've been talking all day about in terms of like how your brisket should feel, because after that long rest, it's starting to kind of relax and we're getting back to that sliceable texture that we are looking for at this point. So it should have a little bit more structure. It's not as bendy as it was before. It's tender, but it's not super, super soft. This is the lean portion, and this is the point. This is where all like the fat and the marbled section of the brisket is. And then this portion right here is also where we took out the heel fat. This is kind of like where the burn ends of a brisket comes from a Texas-style brisket. There aren't really any burn ends typically in Texas-style barbecue. That's usually a Kansas City-style barbecue type thing. But I think over the years, a lot of people who visit Texas always ask if they have burn ends. So usually at restaurants, cutters kind of give them this portion if it's available. First slice that we're gonna do is kind of right in the middle where the lean and the fatty kind of meet. And generally, if we trimmed it right, it's typically right in the center right here. So with this knife, a lot of times you're taught to curl your fingers when you're slicing food or you're cutting things with knife fork. But for this brisket, because it is pretty delicate up top with all the fat and the bark, I'm gonna use the side of my thumb kind of as a gauge, almost as like you would use like the top of your knuckles, but because with a longer blade, and we just wanna make sure this is nice and even, using the side of your thumb kind of helps that brisket not wobble quite as much when you're trying to slice through this. And in the beginning, we want to have a couple of short strokes using the serrations of a knife, kind of break through the bark. Then you can use the entire length of the blade to make nice clean slices. Even after that long rest, we still have quite a bit of juice kind of flowing out of this brisket. You know, definitely don't want to push down on it. You don't want to squeeze all the moisture out of the brisket. And with this brisket, we see the smoke ring around it. We got that fat that's not like super, super white. It's got a little bit of that golden color that's giving us the idea that we rendered it properly with that little bit of high heat like we had towards the end of the cook. So it's gonna be a much sweeter flavor. Even though this brisket might be super, super rich, that extra little bit of smoke is gonna bring a little bit of balance to an entire slice in the brisket. So we're gonna deal with slicing the lean first. And right now we got a little bit of that point still attached to the top, and it's perfectly fine. But when we slice these leans, we want probably a little less than a quarter-inch slices. We want them kind of thin, but thick enough to where they still have some structure. And as you guys can see, I'm using my thumb kind of as that gauge to give me the right and even thickness all the way across and have a nice pull all the way through. Maybe you cooked a little bit too hot and the edges are a little bit more crispy. You can always kind of hold that top portion if it's a little flaky with your fingers back here. So as you pull, all that meat kind of comes together off that slice. In the same way, if I'm slicing the back end is a little shreddy or it's a little overcooked, I can use my thumb as I pull down to make sure I get a nice clean slice. The one thing that we don't want is it to shred. So if you feel like you need to go a little bit slower in order to make sure that the slices are nice and clean, just take your time. You just want to make sure that your slices are nice and even. If you get them to be super thick, they might be a little bit too chewy,
So getting that right thickness, like think about like a slice that you want to put on a sandwich. Like if you're eating like a steak sandwich, you want it to be thick enough where it has a little bit of structure and some chew to it, but not so thick that like you're biting out a huge chunk of meat. And then at the end of this portion of lean, this is also kind of what some people like. It's kind of like the burn end of the lean portion. So we're gonna leave this a little bit thicker on the end just because the slices are super small. But as you can see, the fat on the top is like really, really caramelized and kind of golden. And these are kind of like little nuggets and little samplers that restaurants or the cutters will give customers in line. So for these, cut them into little blocks and cubes. That way when you're feeding customers in line, hopefully you'll give them a bite and they order a pound and a half because it's so good. So that's the deal. So with all these slices, just because we're cutting through the entire thing, we want to make sure all the slices are right next to each other and keep them close. As it gets cut, it's going to dry out really quickly. It's going to change color. So as much as possible, keep those slices right next to each other just until you're ready to serve them. Now we're getting to the point, and this is probably what everyone is looking for, just because it has all that marbling, it has all that fat, it has a little bit more texture, it has a little more height, so it looks a little bit bigger and better. This is the portion where we lopped it off because that was that mohawk that was sticking up. So there's not quite as much meat on this side, so this kind of half to maybe 60% of the brisket, like this is the prime portion right here. This part's a little bit leaner, so if you go to a barbecue restaurant and you ask for fatty or you ask for the point and they're trying to serve you this portion, say, I don't want that, and give me another brisket, because this is a lot of fat and gristle. The grain of the muscle is gonna change. So as we go up to this point in lean, all the muscle fibers are going this way. But as the muscle changes, the grain of the muscle on the point is gonna change. So we're gonna twist this 90 degrees so that we are actually cutting against the grain of the point muscles. Most people will say like my brisket was really, really chewy, and it usually has to do with like one, it's a little undercooked, or they're probably cutting the brisket the wrong way. Now with this portion, we're gonna cut these slices a little bit thicker. The reason being, there's a lot more fat and a lot more collagen kind of going on here. And if you cut them really razor thin, it's most likely gonna fall apart while you're trying to cut it. So this end portion is that burnt ends that everyone's looking for, whereas all the bark on the outside, pretty much all the salt and pepper caked on there. But then when you flip over to show the inside, you got all that marbling speckled throughout. And we know that we did a good job because you can kind of see the lines of fat running through the entire piece. If you cook it too hot, or if you've had this side of the brisket too close to the fire, it almost will look like discolored and really, really dark brown. And that has to do with the fact that it was just overcooked and just beaten over the head with like too much heat during the cook. While we're slicing these slices are gonna be a little bit thicker, maybe slightly over 1/4 inch slices. You wanna make sure that these have some structure when we're serving it to customers. And this is the one that everyone's really looking for. For this point, we're looking for roughly about maybe 1/2 pound per 2 slices. And you know, as you get used to cutting a lot, this is what you're looking for. On this edge right here, it's a little bit more dark red because that's where a lot of the smoke has collected. That's where all the pepper and the salt has kind of caramelized with the fat on top. And that's what some people call kind of like the sugar cookie in barbecue, even though it's not sweet at all. It's like a savory sugar cookie where all the flavors collected at this very end. And as I kind of run my finger across here, you can see how like none of the fibers are like breaking apart. Everything is held together. There's marbling in between these really thick fibers within inside this brisket. That's a perfectly cooked brisket point. Again, like we did with the lean, we're gonna try to keep these slices together because we don't want them oxidized. Because it's got this thick band of fat right down the middle, it can tend to wobble a little bit as you start slicing, which is why keeping this hand on the side so you can press it down a little bit to get it some structure. And as you slice, trying to make sure your knife is straight, because if you take a slight angle, the brisket will get really thick towards the bottom and it will become a little bit more uneven. And with this thick piece, this pole strip is really important. Get a really nice clean slice at the bottom just so it doesn't shred as you're pulling through. And right now we're getting close to that, like we were saying earlier, that 60% that's really good. And now we're getting to a place where it's not bad, it's just not the best that it can be.
So when it gets to where we get to this mohawk or this point that is a little bit taller, some people will just flop it over and just cut off that portion, because this is where all that marbled meat still exists and it's still nice and juicy. It still has a lot of the same kind of muscle structure as the rest of the slices that we just cut. And kind of like we did with the burn ends earlier, these are also pieces that we can cut into chunks, or sometimes some restaurants like to do it where instead of like big nuggets, we'll do in these long kind of strips so they look more like slices. And I think it looks a little bit better when you're serving to a customer. If I feel like there's a lot of marbling, a lot of fat, I'll still serve it to a customer, or I'll ask the customer, hey, would you be interested in this piece, this mohawk piece up top? You know, more people than not will love it just because it has that same sort of flavor profile as those burn ends we were talking about earlier. So just to save this, I'm gonna push this against the rest of the brisket so we can keep this as moist as possible. I'm gonna put these burn ends at top to, again, not expose any of these slices to air. And this is the portion that we're talking about where it is the kind of 30% portion of that point muscle. This is all lean brisket at the bottom with a big chunk of fat. So usually if you are given this at a barbecue restaurant, it's probably used for chopped brisket, just because there's not that much fat underneath. And this portion right here is not great for slices. So if you ever go to a barbecue restaurant and they're trying to serve you this, please ask them to give you a new brisket. So if I was on the block at a barbecue restaurant and I had a piece like this and it's perfect timing, like a customer comes up and they don't actually want sliced brisket, they want chopped. And if I have this portion, I think this makes for a really great chopped beef sandwich, just because the lean underneath here has been sitting underneath the point for a long time. It's got some good structure, it's got some moisture, but it's not overly fatty. So when we come to this point, I'm just going to take my knife and very carefully take off that fat that's sitting on top. And then I'm gonna turn it so that now I'm actually slicing against the grain of that lean like we did earlier, and try to cut this really, really thin, because that way, when we put this onto sandwiches or we chop this up, the muscle fiber is a lot smaller and it makes it a lot easier for customers to eat. It's the reason why I turned it is because now we're cutting against the muscle grain and now it's starting to break apart a little bit more. And if I cut it the same way that we did, we get these really stretchy pieces that we can't really pull apart, and that's because we're cutting with the grain of the muscle. So it's really important to understand like what muscle you're cutting on the brisket, because it's going to change and turn while you're cutting throughout the entire brisket. All right, so now that we have all these pieces kind of chopped up against the grain, usually I'll take a portion where it's like a sandwich portion, which is about a quarter, third of a pound, depending on where you go. And now we're just going to take our bench scraper and we're just going to chop this up. So once it's all chopped up, now you kind of get these brisket chunks into reasonable sized portions. You also kind of mix in a lot of that bark that was kind of sprinkled around the edges, and now you kind of get it mixed all the way through. And that little bit of fat that was sitting on top also gets mixed through. So that's a really nice bite, but in order to maximize getting a good slices of lean, good slices of your fatty brisket, and also taking these pieces that I wouldn't want to serve as slices and turning it into chopped beef is just another way to, like we talked about earlier, using the entire brisket in terms of trim. Now we're finding every single way to use our brisket once it's done cooking. These are the nuggets from the very end of the lean. This is what you would normally give to customers, as treats during the line. This is a lean brisket that we're slicing just less than a quarter of an inch. And this is the point that we slice a little bit thicker than a quarter of an inch, just because it needs a little bit more structure because all that marbling and fat that's in there. These really thin slices are coming from the lean that's sitting right underneath that mohawk. Just because it's a little bit leaner, this is also the portion that I would serve as chopped brisket. These chunks of the burn ends are coming off the very, very top of the mohawk, that even though we can't get full slices, these have all the marbling and all the flavor that you would get from the moist end. The chopped brisket is just from any part of the brisket that you can't serve as slice, but if you chop it up and you get all that seasoning mixed through, it makes for a great sandwich. These are the burn end pieces that you would get on the very end of the moist end, and this is probably a slice that most people are looking for. Now that I showed you guys how to slice this brisket, I'm gonna create a tray that I think kind of gives you the best parts of the brisket to feed to 2 or 3 people. I'm gonna take a couple of these lean slices in very center. These are usually my favorite lean slice to make, and we're gonna shingle them just a little bit so everyone can see that fat that we rendered in there and the grain of the muscle. I like really getting the first 3 slices inside this point muscle where it's nice and fatty and rich. One of the tricks that you can use is take your hand where it's greasy and just kind of rub it so it looks really nice for customers. I'm gonna shingle down and lay that across right here. And just because we really like the customers or your family or friends you're feeding, we're gonna give them these nice burn-end chunks that everyone is looking for. Show them a little bit of the marbling, a little bit of the bark, just give a little variety of texture. There is a perfect way to taste every single part of this brisket and my favorite bites throughout.
All right, we've been cooking our butts off for 12 hours or something. Whoa! That's crazy.
It's like a gusher.
They're sticky. Like crispy, gooey, sticky. Holy smokes. All right, we've conquered Meat Mountain. You really can get an epic brisket on any little cooker. That's delicious, dude. Texas brisket with Joe.
Subscribe to our channel and visit ChefSteps.com for more tips, recipes, guides, and tools to help you level up in the kitchen.